The void's crown drifted through the terminus nebula like a shard of night given purpose, its obsidian hull drinking starlight and offering nothing back. Inside, the trophy hall stretched longer than reason suggested, a cathedral to conquest where crystalline cells hummed their monotonous lullabies of containment. Empress Kaelithra walked its length with the practiced grace of one who had made this pilgrimage 10,000 mornings, and would make it 10,000 more, her bare feet silent against floors that reflected her pale skin in fractured mirror pieces. Her midnight hair, unbound for these private hours, fell past her waist in a cascade that caught the blue glow of the containment fields. The long sweep of her ears, elegant and expressive in ways her courtiers had learned to read like weather patterns, remained relaxed, almost serene. This was her meditation, this observing of caged things. Each cell held a story she had ended, a civilization she had pruned, a defiance she had transformed into decoration. The Kaelithran ambassador in Cell 7 had finally stopped his daily recitation of grievances. It had taken 3 years. In Cell 12, the crystalline entity from Proxima Shift pulsed its bioluminescence in patterns that might be prayer or madness, or simply the metabolic equivalent of breathing. She paused before Cell 19, where the warrior queen of Dust's end sat cross-legged, playing some probability game with colored stones, her strategy unbroken by captivity. Kaelithra appreciated that. Dignity in defeat possessed a certain aesthetic. Then there was Cell 23. Corvain Dresh sat with his back against the far wall, one knee drawn up, the other leg stretched out in a posture of calculated casualness. A scrap of fabric lay across his lap, recycled ship lining, if her assessment was correct, covered in handwriting so small it resembled insect tracks. He was reading it with the concentration of a scholar deciphering sacred texts, occasionally mouthing words she couldn't hear through the containment field's subtle distortion. "Commander," she said, her voice activating the cell's audio interface. Still playing at literature. He looked up without haste, dark eyes finding hers with that particular quality of attention that had first unsettled her 6 months ago. No fear, no hatred, just a kind of patient curiosity, as though she were a particularly complex equation he was still solving. "Empress." He inclined his head with just enough deference to avoid insult, just insufficient reverence to make a point. "I prefer to think of it as maintaining sanity through narrative structure. Your containment fields do wonders for one's focus. No interruptions, no committees, no one asking me to explain my metaphors." Despite herself, the corner of her mouth twitched. "How fortunate for you that defeat came with such amenities. I count my blessings daily." He folded the fabric with care, tucking it into a gap in the cell's environmental regulator. Contraband storage, obviously. She'd observed him building that small library over months, had watched her lower caste crew slip him scraps through maintenance gaps they thought she didn't monitor. She allowed it because broken minds made poor trophies, and because, though she would never articulate this to her court, watching what he chose to preserve fascinated her. Last month it had been pre-expansion poetry. The month before, something that looked like equations rendered in verse form. This week, unless her distance reading had failed her, it appeared to be a comparative analysis of governmental collapse written in iambic pentameter. "I brought you a gift," she said, producing a data tablet from the fold of her ceremonial robe. She'd had it prepared specifically for this exchange, loaded with texts from her private collection that he couldn't possibly access through his scavenging network. His eyebrows rose. "My birthday already, you shouldn't have." "It isn't." She activated the cell's transfer port, a small aperture that irised open just wide enough to accept the tablet before sealing again. Couldn't have him reaching through, after all. Though honestly, she suspected he'd had the theoretical capability to disable his containment field for at least 3 months now, and simply hadn't chosen to exercise it. Another fascinating question. Call it an investment in your continued mental fitness. Unstimulated prisoners grow tedious. He retrieved the tablet, turned it over in his hands with something approaching reverence, thumbed it active and scrolled through the contents, his expression shifting from curiosity to something brighter. The Edicts of Founding, the complete hierarchical reforms of the Fourth Dynasty. Empress, this is your species' constitutional history. Light reading. This is state secrets. This is archaeology. She folded her arms, a gesture her advisors would have recognized as defensive, but which she told herself was simple pragmatism. Those laws are 6,000 years dead, supplanted by modernization and genetic optimization protocols. You're welcome to browse our extinct civic structures. Consider it educational enrichment. So generous. His smile was brief, complicated. Or you're testing whether I'll do something predictably insurgent with them, scan for loopholes, plot impossible rebellions from my comfortable cage. Will you? Probably. He met her gaze with that unnerving directness again. But I'll also just read them because they're beautiful. Your ancestors wrote law like poetry. Every reform is a philosophical treatise wrapped in legal language. Do you know your original succession protocols included provisions for ritual combat poetry? The challenger had to compose a better epic than the sitting ruler or forfeit their claim. She blinked. That's absurd. That's civilization prioritizing different values than military efficiency. He was already reading, finger tracing lines of text, and she recognized the look on his face, the same expression she'd worn centuries ago when first encountering ideas that reshaped understanding. Your people believed governance was an art form. Now it's just genetics and force. That's not evolution, Empress. That's forgetting. Careful, Commander. Your cage has excellent acoustics. I hear every syllable. You asked me to read them. I asked you to be entertained, not to critique millennial policy decisions. Difficult to separate analysis from appreciation in my line of work. He glanced up, something playful beneath the seriousness. Former line of work, I suppose. Current occupation, decorative political prisoner. Hobbies include reading and making my captor uncomfortable with observations about her ancestral governance models. Against all Imperial protocol, Kaelithra laughed, brief and surprised but genuine. Several cells down, the Kaelithran ambassador stirred from his stupor, probably wondering if the universe had inverted itself. You're impossible, she said. I'm bored, there's a difference. He returned to the tablet already absorbed. Thank you for this. Genuinely, even if it is a test or a trap or some elaborate psychological experiment. It's the most interesting thing anyone's given me since you locked me in here. She should leave, resume her rounds, observe the other trophies with the same clinical detachment she'd cultivated over centuries of rule. Instead, she found herself asking, "What are you writing?" Currently, a comparative analysis of prison architecture across 8 civilizations. He gestured at the fabric he'd tucked away. The outer reach colonies used to build their detention centers with windows, actual physical windows. They believed even criminals deserved to see stars. Your people build cages that hum. Constant sound, constant blue light. Sensory deprivation disguised as containment, both effective, both revealing about the cultures that designed them. And what does my choice reveal? That you view imprisonment as transformation. Not punishment, not rehabilitation, metamorphosis. You're trying to turn us into different things, quieter things, more aesthetically pleasing in our defeat. He paused, considering. It's working on everyone except me, I think. Your arrogance is noted. My self-awareness is functional. He smiled again, that brief flash of something that might be humor or might be challenge or might be both. You keep visiting my cell, Empress, every morning for 6 months. You bring me books now. That's not standard trophy maintenance. So either I'm succeeding at staying interesting, or you're developing a concerning fascination with your defeated enemies, or, he stopped himself. Or, nothing. Speculation above my station. The ship's AI chimed softly, reminding her that morning court convened in 30 minutes. She had advisors to intimidate, genetic reports to review, a war council that would demand strategic decisions about the fractured alliance's growing boldness. All the machinery of empire that required her attention. But she stayed a moment longer, watching this human return to his reading, his focus already absolute, as though she'd ceased to exist. It was that ability to dismiss her, not with contempt but with genuine redirection of attention, that kept drawing her back. "Stay in your cage, Commander," she said finally, voice soft with something she refused to name. He didn't look up from the tablet. Where else would I go? The War Council chamber smelled of ozone and ambition, though Kaelithra suspected the latter was purely psychological. Her advisors arranged themselves in the traditional hierarchy, geneticists near her right hand, military commanders to her left, the economic manipulators forming a careful arc behind them all. Each wore their caste modifications with varying degrees of pride. Enhanced neural ridges, luminescent skin patterns, eyes that process spectrums beyond baseline biology. She found herself wondering, not for the first time this week, when exactly enhancement had become indistinguishable from costume jewelry. "The fractured alliance has been unusually quiet," Commander Theloria was saying, her four arms gesturing at the holographic display that dominated the chamber's center. Fleet positions glowed like constellations, enemy formations marked in aggressive crimson. 17 days since their last probe, no communications, no posturing. "They're planning something substantial," offered genetic overseer Marthies, his voice modulated to 3 harmonics simultaneously, a modification he'd insisted made him more persuasive in negotiations. Kaelithra mostly found it gave her headaches, probably consolidating resources for a coordinated strike. "Probably they've realized challenging us is suicidal," countered Admiral Vesh. "We've decimated their raids for 3 years running. Eventually, even inferior genetics learn from pain." Kaelithra's ears flicked with irritation. A micro-expression her court had learned meant choose your next words carefully. Inferior genetics built the quantum fold drives we're currently using, Admiral. The fractured alliance may be many things, but dismissing them as stupid is how empires collapse from complacency. Vesh had the grace to look chagrined. "Of course, Empress, I merely meant that you've forgotten the Shalvek uprising used the same 3-week silence before they nearly destroyed the Fourth Fleet." She let the words settle like frost. "Continue underestimating patterns at your leisure. I'll be here when the consequences arrive." The hologram flickered, just briefly, a half-second stutter in the projection that made one of the enemy fleet markers jump positions before correcting itself. Kaelithra's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The ship's AI had been developing peculiar hiccups for weeks now, minor things, environmental controls adjusting without input, lights in her private quarters dimming in sequences that almost resembled rhythm. Her chief engineer blamed it on quantum interference from the nebula, which was plausible enough that she'd accepted it. But she'd ruled for 3 centuries by trusting her instincts more than her subordinates' convenience. Empress Theloria was watching her with concern. "Should we increase patrols in the outer sectors?" "Yes, and run a full diagnostic on all primary systems." She kept her voice casual, as though the thought had just occurred to her. "When was our last comprehensive technical review?" "6 months ago," supplied her chief engineer, a rail-thin woman named Kess whose genetic modifications ran toward enhanced mathematical processing. "All systems optimal within established parameters." "Run another one. Prioritize the AI core and navigational matrices." "That's extensive, Empress. It'll require shutting down secondary systems across 8 decks and then it's fortunate we're not currently in combat." Kaelithra's ears flattened slightly, the equivalent of someone raising their voice without actually doing so. "I want it completed within 2 days. Allocate whatever resources necessary." Kess bowed, recognizing dismissal when it was offered with teeth. The council continued through logistical reports, resource allocations, genetic compliance statistics from their tributary worlds. Kaelithra participated with her usual precision, making decisions that would ripple across star systems, but part of her attention remained on the hologram, watching for another flicker that didn't come. When they finally adjourned, she made her way not to her quarters but down 17 levels to the engineering sectors, where the ship's lower castes maintained the machinery that kept the Void's crown functional. The corridors here lacked the obsidian grandeur of the upper decks, just utilitarian metal and exposed conduit work, the bones of empire visible beneath the skin. A young engineer nearly dropped his plasma welder when he rounded a corner and found the Empress standing there unescorted. His genetic markers identified him as bottom tier. No modifications, basic labor classification, the sort of crew member who might live their entire life aboard without ever being acknowledged by command staff. Apologies, Empress, we weren't informed. Should I clear this section? His panic was genuine and oddly refreshing after hours of calculated court maneuvering. Relax, I'm simply conducting an informal inspection. She gestured at the wall panel he'd been repairing. What's the issue here? Oh, just a power fluctuation in the environmental controls. Third one this week in this sector. Keeps adjusting the temperature down by 0.3 degrees every 6 hours. Not dangerous, just odd. Odd how? He blinked, clearly uncertain if this was a test. Well, it's like it's happening on a schedule. Not random system degradation. More like someone programmed it deliberately, except nobody did. I checked the logs 3 times. Kaelithra felt something cold settle in her chest. Show me. The engineer, his badge identified him as Tesh, Maintenance Class 7, pulled up his diagnostic tablet with trembling hands. The data scrolled past, and yes, there it was, environmental adjustments occurring in precise intervals. Not just in this sector, across maintenance areas throughout the lower decks. Have you reported this to Chief Engineer Kess? I filed a ticket, but he trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. Lower caste observations rarely traveled upward unless they represented immediate catastrophic failure. 1/3 of a degree temperature variance didn't qualify. File another one, Kaelithra said quietly. Reference my direct authorization. And Tesh, if you notice any other odd patterns, any irregularities at all, I want them reported immediately to my personal comm channel, not the standard maintenance queue. She transmitted her secure frequency to his tablet, watching his expression cycle from confusion to something approaching terror at being given such direct access. I don't. Empress, I'm just a thermal systems tech, I don't think. You think well enough to notice patterns your superiors missed. She met his eyes, let him see she was serious. The Void's crown is mine. Every rivet, every power coupling, every soul aboard. I don't care about genetic rankings when someone threatens what belongs to me. Understand? He nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She left him there and continued deeper into the ship's infrastructure, following instinct more than logic, until she found herself near the detention sectors. The trophy hall ran through the central axis, but the support systems that powered those crystalline cages extended into the surrounding decks like roots. A maintenance drone hovered near an access panel, its optical sensors flickering in a pattern that made her pause. Flash, pause, flash, flash, pause, flash, 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 counting. The drones were semi-autonomous, programmed for routine repairs, but this one seemed to be waiting for something. She approached slowly, and it immediately shifted to standard patrol behavior, moving away with mechanical disinterest. But she'd seen it. The pattern, prime numbers, 2, 3, 5. Someone was communicating through the maintenance systems, using the ship's own automated infrastructure to send messages that wouldn't appear in any official logs. It was elegant, audacious, and would require someone with both technical expertise and enormous patience to implement. Someone with nothing but time. Kaelithra stood very still in that utilitarian corridor, surrounded by the humming machinery of her flagship, and felt the universe shift slightly sideways beneath her feet. She thought of Corvain Dresh reading constitutional law in his cell, of 6 months of morning conversations that had seemed like harmless indulgence in keeping her trophy interesting, of a man who had commanded rebel fleets through asymmetrical warfare, who thought in poetry and strategy simultaneously, who smiled at her like she was a puzzle worth solving. She'd given him books on governmental structure, access to her empire's foundational philosophy, and he'd been teaching mathematics to maintenance drones. "Oh," she said aloud to the empty corridor. "Oh, you brilliant, impossible fool." Then she started walking towards cell 23, her mind already racing through implications, trying to calculate how far his network extended, wondering what exactly he'd been building while she'd been congratulating herself on keeping him contained. The fractured alliance emerged from quantum fold space with the subtlety of a collapsing star, their ships materializing in attack formation across 3 vectors that should have been mathematically impossible to coordinate without being detected. Kaelithra was halfway through her 3rd cup of stimulant tea when the proximity alarms transformed her private quarters into a screaming mechanical chorus. She didn't run to the command throne. Running implied panic, and panic infected crews faster than hull breaches. Instead, she walked with deliberate purpose through corridors that had begun strobing emergency crimson, her bare feet finding purchase on deck plates that shuddered with each impact against the shields. Officers scrambled past her, some remembering to bow mid-sprint, others too focused on survival to care about protocol. The throne room had transformed into controlled chaos. Theloria was already coordinating defensive formations, her 4 arms dancing across multiple control interfaces simultaneously. Admiral Vesh stood rigid at the tactical display, barking orders that his subordinates rushed to implement. The holographic battlespace showed 37 enemy vessels hammering at their position, using the gravity well they'd been traversing as both weapon and trap. Shields at 73% and falling. Someone reported with admirable calm considering they were about to die. Kaelithra settled into her throne, the neural interface activating with a familiar electric whisper against her skull. Data flooded her consciousness, damage reports, power distribution, tactical probabilities all rendered in the crystalline clarity of direct mental processing. Why aren't weapons responding? We're firing, Empress, but the targeting solutions are degrading. 3-second delay on each calculation. Theloria's expression was professionally neutral, which meant she was terrified. The AI is prioritizing defense protocols, but something's fragmenting the response time. Something. Kaelithra pulled up the system diagnostics herself, watching error cascades ripple through subsystems like digital disease. These aren't random failures. Look at the pattern. Life support degradation in non-essential decks, exactly the sections that would force crew redistribution. Shield generators cycling at intervals that create predictable weak points. Someone's conducting a symphony of sabotage. Impossible, Vesh said flatly. We swept for infiltrators after the last. Not infiltrators. She was already cross-referencing the malfunctions with her earlier observations. Environmental controls adjusting on schedule. Maintenance drones signaling in prime numbers. 6 months of a human prisoner reading constitutional law while she'd assumed she was indulging a harmless hobby. Get me a full override on the AI core. Authorization Kaelithra void absolute. The ship's computer chimed its acknowledgement, then hesitated. Actually hesitated, a half-second pause that shouldn't exist in quantum processors. Override accepted, it finally said, but the voice modulation was fractionally off. However, implementing command protocols will require. An explosion somewhere aft cut off the explanation, close enough that the throne room's emergency fields activated, shimmering barriers designed to protect the command staff from sudden decompression. Through the main viewport, she watched a fractured Alliance cruiser angle for a kill shot, its weapons arrays charging with light that promised obliteration. Then the lights went out. Not everywhere. Just the throne room and, based on the sudden uptick in screaming from the comm channels, approximately 40% of the ship's primary systems. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in crimson unreality. What just happened? She asked with dangerous quiet. Total power redistribution, Kess reported from somewhere in the chaos. Everything just rerouted through secondary and tertiary systems. We're running on backup generators that weren't even supposed to be active during. Empress? The shout came from a junior officer at the communications station, her genetically enhanced vocal cords making the word echo. We're receiving a message, internal origin, audio only. Play it. Static, then a voice she'd heard that very morning discussing the philosophical implications of ritual combat poetry. Apologies for the dramatic timing, Corvain Dresh said, sounding remarkably composed for someone who should still be locked in a crystalline cage. But I thought we should talk about your succession protocols. Specifically, the ones you gave me to read. Very illuminating material, by the way. Your ancestors had some fascinating ideas about legitimate transfers of power. Every head in the throne room turned toward Kaelithra. She kept her expression carved from ice, despite the part of her mind that was screaming several conflicting things simultaneously, primary among them being respect for the sheer audacity. "Commander Dresh," she said, her voice activating the ship-wide intercom. "I'm going to assume you have an excellent explanation for committing suicide by sabotage during an active battle." "Oh, I'm not sabotaging, I'm optimizing. Your ship's AI has been running the same combat algorithms for 300 years. Very effective against enemies who fight like you do. Utterly predictable against anyone who studied your tactical doctrine, which I have, because I had literally nothing else to do for 6 months except read and think, and occasionally have fascinating conversations about governance with my captor." Another explosion, closer now. The fractured alliance wasn't waiting for whatever internal drama was unfolding aboard the Void's crown to resolve itself. "Where is he?" Kaelithra demanded of her security chief. "Cell 23 shows containment field active, but..." The officer's confusion was palpable. "Empress, he's still in his cell. I'm looking at the surveillance feed right now. He's sitting there with a tablet talking to us." "Because I don't need to leave to do what I'm doing," Corvin continued, maddeningly calm. "Your maintenance crews have been very helpful. Also, your lower caste engineers are criminally underutilized. Tesh sends his regards, by the way." Kaelithra felt something crystallize in her chest, not quite rage, not quite admiration, something that tasted like both and neither. "You've been building a network, using my own crew. Using people who are tired of being genetic footnotes in your empire story. Turns out, when you treat skilled workers like interchangeable components, they're remarkably receptive to alternative perspectives. Who knew?" He paused, and she heard what might have been weapons fire in the background of wherever he was actually transmitting from. "But we can discuss my insurgent recruiting methods later. Right now, you have 37 ships trying to kill you with weapons systems I've been fragmenting for 3 weeks. They think you're compromised and vulnerable. They're half right. Only half. You're compromised. But vulnerable assumes you don't have someone who's been wargaming exactly this scenario for months." His voice shifted, lost the conversational tone, and gained an edge she recognized from intelligence briefings about his rebel campaigns. "Your tactical doctrine is brilliant for dominance warfare. It's terrible for asymmetrical defense. The fractured alliance attacks in waves, cycling their ships through predictable rotation patterns to maximize sustained bombardment. They've done it in every engagement for 5 years. I'm aware of their tactics, Commander." "Then you know they expect you to meet force with force, shields with shields, formation against formation. They've calculated your probable responses to 7 decimal places." Another explosion, and this time she felt the deck actually tilt beneath her feet. "But they haven't calculated what happens if you stop fighting like an empire and start fighting like a rebellion. Theloria caught Kaelithra's eye, her expression asking the question they were all thinking. Was this a coup or a collaboration? What exactly are you proposing? Kaelithra asked. Give me temporary command authority over defensive systems. Not the ship, not your throne, just the battle. Let me reconfigure your AI to implement strategies your enemies won't expect because they're not in your tactical database. Stop trying to overpower them and start trying to outsmart them. And why, she said slowly, would I trust you with access to my ship's core systems during combat? Because if I wanted you dead, I could have vented atmosphere to the throne room 10 minutes ago. Because I've had the ability to disable your shields completely for at least a week and haven't. Because, and this is the important part, I still need you alive to invoke the right of succession through trial, which is substantially less impressive if you're a corpse when I claim it. The throne room went absolutely silent. Even the explosion seemed to pause out of sheer shock. You're insane, Vesh breathed. I'm expedient, Corvin corrected. Also, you have approximately 90 seconds before that Alliance dreadnought finishes charging its planet cracker cannon, so perhaps we could table the psychological evaluations for after we survive. Kaelithra looked at the tactical display, at the 37 ships that had them bracketed, at her own forces struggling to respond through systems that were fighting her at every command. She thought about constitutional law and maintenance drones, and 6 months of morning conversations with a man who smiled like he was solving puzzles. She thought about empires that forgot how to adapt, and the difference between power inherited and power earned. Then she did something that would probably haunt her advisor's nightmares for decades. Grant Command Override Dresh Provisional Alpha, she said clearly. Authorization Kaelithra Void Absolute. Execute. The ship's AI hummed, and this time the hesitation felt like satisfaction. Acknowledged, it said in Corvin's voice. Now let's see what happens when rebels teach emperors how to fight. The first thing Corvin did with command authority was shut down weapons on the port side completely, which caused Admiral Vesh to make a sound like a dying animal. He's surrendering us. The Admiral lunged toward the throne, stopped only by Theloria's restraining hand. Empress, this is madness, he's going to. Be quiet and watch, Kaelithra said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Her neural interface showed power redistributing across the ship in patterns that looked less like military doctrine and more like abstract art. Commander, I hope you're aware that I will personally execute you if this is an elaborate method of suicide. Noted and appreciated, Corvin replied, his voice now integrated directly into the throne room systems. Tesh, how's the starboard capacitor array looking? Charged to 160%, came a nervous response from someone who definitely wasn't authorized to speak on command channels. This is beyond safety parameters, I don't. Perfect. Dump it all into the forward shields and angle us 23 degrees relative to the dreadnought's firing solution. The Void's crown lurched. Kaelithra's stomach attempted to relocate to somewhere near her spine, as the massive flagship executed a maneuver that ships of this class absolutely were not designed to perform. Through the viewport, she watched the Alliance dreadnought fire its planet cracker, a beam of concentrated energy that would have vaporized them if they'd been where every tactical algorithm predicted they'd be. Instead, it passed close enough that the radiation made her teeth ache, close enough that the forward shield screamed and collapsed under the thermal load, close enough that she could see the individual hull plates on the enemy ship as they swept past in what could only be described as a combat drift. Releasing debris cloud, Corvin announced. Also, someone tell Deck 9 that I'm sorry about their recreational facilities. They're about to become external. Explosive bolts fired, jettisoning an entire section of the ship's lower decks. The exact sections he'd been causing environmental failures in for weeks, Kaelithra realized. The debris spread out in their wake, creating a field of obstacles that the pursuing Alliance cruisers had to navigate around or through. That was our secondary mess hall, Kess said faintly. It was already scheduled for renovation, Corvin said. I checked the maintenance logs. You're welcome. Now everyone brace for entirely too much acceleration. The engines fired at angles that made the inertial dampeners weep. Kaelithra felt her bones compress as they shot forward, threading between two Alliance destroyers that had been moving to flank them. One of the destroyers tried to adjust course and ended up clipping its partner's shields, triggering a cascade failure that turned them both into temporarily disabled obstacles. Did you just make them crash into each other? Theloria asked with something approaching awe. They crashed into each other. I simply provided the spatial geometry that made it inevitable. He paused. Tesh, I need you to reroute tertiary power through the waste reclamation systems. The waste, Commander, that's going to create a feedback loop that could explode impressively. Yes, that's the idea. Give me 30 seconds, then vent it all at the coordinates I'm sending you now. Kaelithra watched the tactical display update with a new targeting solution that pointed at empty space between 3 Alliance frigates. There's nothing there. Not yet, but there will be in approximately 28 seconds when their formation rotation brings them into convergence. His voice carried the kind of certainty that came from having run these calculations 1,000 times in a crystalline cell. Your enemies fight on schedules, Empress, patterns, rotations. It makes them efficient and predictable, and I've been predicting them for months. The Void's crown shuddered as waste reclamation systems, never designed to handle combat-level power loads, did exactly what Tesh had warned they would do. The explosion vented through emergency ports directly into the space where, as Corvin had predicted, 3 Alliance frigates were executing their rotation pattern. Superheated plasma and partially processed organic waste created a cloud that was as disgusting as it was effective. The frigate's sensors went blind simultaneously, their formation broke apart in confusion, and 2 of them fired on each other before realizing their mistake. Did you just weaponize our sewage? Kaelithra asked. Waste not, want not. Also, the Alliance uses optical targeting for close-quarters combat. Any sufficiently dense particulate cloud will compromise their acquisition systems. I learned that from a children's game in the outer reaches. Hide and seek, but with more explosions. Vesh was staring at the tactical display like it had personally betrayed him. This isn't warfare. This is chaos. This is asymmetrical defense, Corvin corrected. You can't beat them ship to ship. They outnumber you, they're fresher, and they've planned for every standard response. But they haven't planned for a 300-year-old flagship to start fighting like a cornered smuggler with improvised weapons and zero regard for proper military conduct. I'm going to need therapy after this battle, Theloria muttered, but her fingers were already adjusting their approach vectors to match the madness Corvin was orchestrating. The next 20 minutes were the most undignified combat engagement in the Void's crown's proud history. Corvin had them dump coolant to create ice fields that fouled enemy sensors. He used the trophy hall's containment field generators to create a fake power signature that drew 6 Alliance ships into a pursuit that ended with them tangled in the Terminus Nebula's magnetic eddies. At one point, he vented the entire contents of the botanical gardens into space, which did nothing tactically but apparently amused him. Was that necessary? Kaelithra demanded as genetically engineered orchids drifted past the viewport. No, but I've been staring at your decorative plants through my cell walls for 6 months and wanted to share the experience. Call it petty revenge with no strategic value. You're insane. I'm effective, there's a difference. Speaking of which, your chief engineer is about to have a crisis. Kes, before you object, yes, I know the main engines were never designed to do what I'm about to ask them to do. I also know they can, because I've been reading their maintenance specifications for 4 months, and your safety margins are excessively conservative. What are you? Kes started. The Void's crown executed something that was either the most brilliant combat maneuver in recent history, or the most catastrophic navigational error ever recorded. They dropped into a full reverse burn while simultaneously rotating 90 degrees on 3 axes, creating a vector that shouldn't have been possible without tearing the ship apart. Instead, it placed them directly behind the Alliance dreadnought, in the blind spot where its own massive engines blocked targeting solutions. "Now," Corvin said quietly, "all weapons point-blank range, target their shield generators. Fire until they break or we do." The Void's Crown's remaining weapons batteries opened up at distances where close quarters was an understatement. Energy beams carved through the dreadnought's shields at angles designed for exactly this impossibility, concentrated on points that Corvin had clearly identified through obsessive study. The shields held for 3 seconds, then 5, then collapsed entirely as the generators overloaded from focused bombardment. The dreadnought tried to maneuver, but ships that size didn't turn quickly, and Corvin had positioned them perfectly to stay in the blind spot as it rotated. "Hail them," Kaelithra said suddenly. "Offer surrender terms." Empress Vesh looked confused. "We've demonstrated we can destroy them. Actual destruction is wasteful." She opened the channel herself. "Alliance Dreadnought, this is Empress Kaelithra of the Void's Crown. Your shields are down, your formation is broken, and you're in my weapons envelope. Withdraw now and I'll let you limp home to report how badly you miscalculated. Stay, and I'll turn your flagship into debris that will orbit this nebula for the next 1,000 years. You have 30 seconds. The channel stayed silent for 28 of those seconds. Then, "We're withdrawing. The Alliance remembers this." "Please do," Kaelithra said pleasantly. "And when you report, mention that the Void's Crown has learned some new tricks, just so they don't make the same mistakes next time." The Alliance fleet began their retreat, quantum drives charging for fold space jumps that would take them far from this humiliation. Kaelithra watched them go, then looked at the damage reports scrolling across her neural interface. Shields at 19%. Hull breaches on 7 decks. The mess hall was gone. The botanical gardens were currently orbiting somewhere in local space. Her chief engineer was having what looked like a stress-induced breakdown. But they'd won, against impossible odds using tactics that would make military historians weep with confusion. They'd won. "Commander Dresh," she said into the comm, "report to the throne room, immediately." "About that," Corvin replied, "I should probably mention that I'm not actually in my cell anymore. Haven't been for about 40 minutes. Currently standing in your trophy hall with 12 very nervous maintenance workers and a surprisingly effective improvised plasma cutter. So if you're planning to execute me for this whole thing, you should know I'm already out of my cage." Kaelithra closed her eyes, took a breath, decided that she'd process the full implications of the last hour later when her hands stopped shaking from adrenaline and her empire wasn't quite so thoroughly humiliated by its own prisoner. "Then walk to the throne room like a civilized person," she said. "We need to discuss succession rights, apparently, and you're buying me new orchids." Corvin walked into the throne room flanked by 12 of the most terrified people Kaelithra had ever seen, each of them wearing maintenance jumpsuits and expressions that suggested they were attending their own executions. Tesh looked particularly likely to faint, his hands clutching a toolkit like it might offer protection against Imperial displeasure. Corvin himself looked exactly as composed as he had that morning in his cell, except now he was covered in carbon scoring and what appeared to be coolant residue. He'd acquired a plasma cutter from somewhere, though he held it casually at his side rather than as a weapon. "Empress," he said, inclining his head with that same insufficient reverence that had always unsettled her. "Lovely view from your throne. Really brings out the obsidian." Every courtier in the room was staring. Admiral Vesh had his hand on his sidearm. Theloria's 4 arms were tensed in combat readiness. The emergency lighting still bathed everything in crimson unreality, making the whole scene feel like something from a fever dream. Kaelithra gestured for her guards to stand down before someone did something catastrophically stupid. "You invoked the right of succession through trial. In the middle of a battle, using laws that haven't been applied in 6,000 years. Technically, I invoked them after the battle started, but before I actually escaped my cell, so the timeline is somewhat ambiguous. He set the plasma cutter down carefully on the deck. Also, I saved your ship using tactics your empire apparently forgot existed, which feels relevant to the whole, demonstrating mastery over the tools of empire requirement. You weaponized our waste reclamation systems. I optimized available resources in service of Imperial defense. There's a difference. You vented my botanical gardens into space for no tactical reason. Minor artistic flourish. I'm willing to accept criticism on that point. He smiled, brief and genuine. Though you have to admit, the orchids looked better as orbital debris than they did behind containment fields. Despite everything, the damaged ship, the shocked court, the fundamental impossibility of what she was about to do, Kaelithra felt laughter building in her chest. She suppressed it through sheer force of will, because empresses did not giggle at their prisoners' insurgencies, no matter how effective. The right, she said carefully, requires that the challenger demonstrate superior understanding of governance and command. You've certainly demonstrated creativity. Whether that constitutes qualification for rulership is debatable. I'm not actually trying to take your throne. He said it so casually that it took a moment for the words to register. The courtier's confusion was palpable. I invoked the right because it was the only legal framework I could find that would give me authority to act in crisis without it being mutiny. Your laws are very clear. During a trial of succession, the challenger has temporary co-authority to prove their capability. I needed command access. You needed someone who thought differently than your standard doctrine. The right provided both. Kaelithra's ears flicked forward despite her attempt at neutrality. You weaponized constitutional law. I weaponized everything available. It's kind of my specialty. He glanced at his nervous confederates. Also, these people deserve protection from consequences. They followed orders from someone who technically had legal authority under ancient precedent, which means punishing them for my insurgency would violate your own succession protocols. Just so we're clear on that, you're protecting your recruits by hiding behind legal technicalities. I prefer to think of it as respecting the rule of law while acknowledging that said laws were written by people who understood governance was complicated. He met her eyes with that unnerving directness. Your ancestors built a system that allowed for challenge and change. Your modern empire forgot why that mattered. I just reminded you. Vesh made a strangled sound. Empress, you cannot possibly be considering. Be quiet, Admiral. She didn't look away from Corvain, studying him like he was an equation that kept producing unexpected solutions. You saved my ship. Used my own crew, my own systems, my own constitutional history against both me and my enemies. You've proven that someone locked in a cage with nothing but time and books can still reshape an empire from the inside. What exactly are you expecting to happen now? Honestly, I'm hoping you don't execute me. He spread his hands. After that, I'm flexible. You could put me back in my cell, though we both know the containment field is symbolic at this point. You could exile me, though that seems wasteful given I apparently have useful strategic insights. Or you could acknowledge that maybe your empire's greatest weakness isn't external threats but internal rigidity, and perhaps having someone around who thinks sideways might be valuable. You want a position in my court. I want to not die. The court position would be a pleasant bonus. He paused. Also, I want access to your restricted archives, the pre-4th Dynasty material. I've read everything you gave me, and I have so many questions about the Treaty of Stellar Concordance. You're negotiating for library privileges. I'm a simple man with simple needs. Kaelithra stood from her throne, descended the steps until she was standing directly in front of him. Close enough to see the carbon scoring on his collar, the coolant stains on his sleeves, the absolute lack of fear in his expression. He'd orchestrated a rebellion, invoked ancient laws, saved her ship through methods that would mortify military historians, and now he was asking for books. "You're the most infuriating human I've ever encountered," she said quietly. "I've been called worse by better people. Your tactics were undignified, improvised, and completely contrary to every principle of Imperial warfare. And they worked. And they worked," she conceded. She was aware of her entire court watching, of this moment that would ripple through her empire's history regardless of what she decided. "The right of succession requires that I acknowledge your demonstration of capability or formally refute it. If I refute it, you're a mutineer and I execute you. If I acknowledge it, you have legitimate claim to challenge me for the throne. Or," Corvain said carefully, "you could interpret it the way your ancestors did. Not as binary challenge, but as proof of capability for partnership. The original texts mention joint governance in cases where the challenger demonstrates complementary rather than superior skills. Your fourth dynasty had co-regents for 3 centuries, before genetic purity became more important than functional government." The throne room went absolutely silent. "You want to be my co-regent," Kaelithra said flatly. "I want to keep reading interesting books and occasionally suggesting that your empire remember it used to value adaptability over pedigree." He smiled. "The title is negotiable: advisor, strategist, court jester who happens to know constitutional law. I'm not particular." She should refuse. Should execute him for the principle of it, restore order, prove that empires didn't bend to clever humans with plasma cutters and sewage-based tactics. Should do exactly what 3 centuries of genetic supremacy doctrine demanded. Instead, she thought about maintenance drones signaling in prime numbers, about lower caste engineers with useful observations that never reached command, about an empire so convinced of its superiority that it had forgotten how to learn from anyone different, about morning conversations in front of a crystalline cell with someone who made her think in ways she'd stopped allowing herself. "I acknowledge your demonstration of capability," she said formally, the words binding under ancient law. "You have proven mastery of imperial systems through unconventional means. However, I'm not giving you my throne. You'd be terrible at the ceremonial aspects. Completely fair assessment. Instead, I'm creating a new position. Strategic advisor for asymmetrical operations, answerable directly to me. Your first assignment is to review our entire military doctrine and identify every other place where we've become predictable through tradition." "I can do that." "Your second assignment is to stop teaching my maintenance crews to subvert ship systems, or at least get permission before turning them into insurgents." "That one might take longer." She turned to Tesh and his terrified companions. "You're all promoted. Report to Chief Engineer Kess tomorrow for reassignment to specialized operations. Tell her anyone who can help build an invisible network through Imperial infrastructure is exactly the kind of creative thinking we need more of." Tesh looked like he might actually faint from relief. "And you," she said, turning back to Corvain, "you're still sleeping in a cell." "Really? Not the crystalline cage. I'm having quarters prepared in the diplomatic wing, but they're still technically detention facilities, because I refuse to let you wander my ship unsupervised until I'm certain you haven't hidden any other surprises in the waste reclamation systems." "The botanical gardens. I'm billing you for those." He laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected in the aftermath of battle that several courtiers flinched. "Deal. Though I should mention I have absolutely no currency, assets, or means of payment. Then you'll work it off through service to the Empire." She allowed herself a small smile, starting with explaining to Admiral Vesh why sewage makes an effective tactical weapon, in detail, with diagrams. Vesh made that dying animal sound again. Kaelithra returned to her throne, settled into its familiar contours, and looked out at her court with their shocked expressions and their genetic superiority and their complete inability to process what had just happened. Good, let them be confused, let them question, Let them remember that empires stayed strong by adapting, not by calcifying around old certainties. Dismissed, she said. Except you, Commander. We need to discuss your reading list for the next 6 months. Also, you're teaching me that children's game from the outer reaches, the one with explosions. It's really more about hiding than explosions. We'll add the explosions ourselves. As her court filed out in various states of bewilderment, Corvin climbed the steps to stand beside her throne. Not sitting, not presuming, just present in a way that felt less like subordination and more like partnership. Thank you, he said quietly, for not executing you, for considering that maybe cages only hold what chooses to be held. She looked at him, this human who'd turned her empire sideways with poetry and mathematics, and an absolute refusal to accept that conquest meant ending. Stay in your quarters, Commander, that's an order. Where else would I go? But they both knew he'd already left cages behind, had taken something from her throne room that wasn't power or authority but possibility itself. And somehow, impossibly, she found she didn't mind the theft at all.